How the leader of the Illuminati caused the sinking of the Titanic. David Icke Oink was responsible. The iceberg that sank Titanic had help. The sinking of RMS Titanic was one of the greatest maritime disasters of all time. Over 1,500 passengers and crew lost their lives in April 1912 when the White Star liner Titanic sank after hitting an iceberg. The ship took just over 2.5 hours to descend to its watery grave in the cold North Atlantic. The greater part of the victims of the Titanic disaster lost their lives because there was a criminal shortage of lifeboats on board on that never-to-be-forgotten night. Blame has been apportioned to many sources for why the greatest passenger liner of the day met with the fatal accident. There are those who maintain that the captain had ordered the ship to travel too fast, or that he had ignored iceberg warnings. Others point the finger at the radio operator for not delivering vital ice warnings to the bridge. Some say that if there had been a pair of binoculars available to look at in the crow's nest Titanic, the disaster could have been averted. He would have seen the iceberg on time, Titanic would have berthed in the port of New York safely, and everybody would have been saved. All of these things were undoubtedly contributory factors, but the real villain of the piece was the iceberg. If that great big mountain of frozen freshwater had not loomed up in front of RMS Titanic on that fatal night, all would have been well. People have always wondered why an iceberg would have been so far away from its usual area. When the great ship collided with it, Titanic was on the same latitude as New York. Large masses of ice are just not usually found so far south. But this iceberg was. There had to be a reason. As the president of the Ancient Society of Secret Historians, much information that is hidden from the generality is known to me. Today I am going to tell the truth about how an iceberg struck Titanic and how it wasn't just sitting in the way in the middle of the sea lane. It had been put there, and it was actually pushed against the side of the great ship. That is why it was impossible for the helmsman to steer the vessel away in sufficient time to avert catastrophe. It was the Illuminati that caused the sinking of the Titanic, or, to be exact, the iceberg had been pig-handled all the way from the Greenland ice sheets by the leader of the Illuminati, David Icke Oink. This is probably a good time to pause and explain that the leader of the Illuminati is a failed British television presenter called David Icke Oink. This man-pig is responsible for one of the greatest instances of black propaganda ever foisted on a gullible public. He claims that there is a powerful group called the Illuminati who are shape-shifting reptiles, and that these people, snakes, are the secret and very malevolent rulers of the world. His specialty is to make outrageously offensive accusations against the British royal family, who he regards as the reptiles in chief. The clever thing about all this, and what makes his rant so fiendish, is that it is all designed to distract attention from the truth, which is that the Illuminati are really shape-shifting pigs, and that he himself, David Icke Oink, is the real leader of that whole rotten crew. You might well ask what David Icke Oink had to do with the sinking of the Titanic. The plain fact of the matter is that his mania for blaming the better off section of society for the world's ills, in order to deflect attention away from the fact that he is himself the leader of the Illuminati, had so much taken over his porcine brain that he would stop at nothing to further that false belief. Some of the very top people from the year 1912 would be aboard Titanic. His twisted brain saw this as a perfect opportunity to strike out at those whom he hated. I must explain here that the Illuminati are all accomplished time travellers as well as shapeshifters, and David Icke stroke Oink has always been one of the most proficient. This can account for how he was able to perform such feats as tempting Eve. The Bible got that one wrong. It was a pig, not a serpent, and the apple came from Tesco. It was Granny Smith, incidentally. How the iceberg came to meet Titanic. You might well wonder how a pig human, no matter how determined, would be able to take control of an iceberg and steer it all the way from Greenland and then crash it into the side of a great sea liner. What you need to understand is that when a great ego is allied with a truly awesome malevolence in one being, and there is no ego more stupendous than the one that consumes David Icke stroke Oink, it can inflate the actual physical body to gigantic proportions. So, when the leader of the Illuminati splashed down into the icy seas off Greenland, he was at least 1,000 feet tall, and he weighed more than 600 tons. Of course he was in his pig guise. Using his porcine body was the best way to keep warm in the freezing seas, because all the fat gave him perfect insulation. In the seas around Greenland there are many icebergs. They had fallen off the leading edges of the glaciers that descended to the ocean from that huge, largely icebound island. It didn't take too long for David Icke stroke Oink to actually select one that suited his nefarious purpose. The berg was at least the area of 2 football pitches. Its icy pinnacle reached to about 400 feet above the level of the sea, and it descended 10 times that underneath the almost frozen brine. With the superhuman, porcine strength that his psychopathic rage bestowed on him, he started to push his gigantic ship slicer south towards the sea lanes. It would take him about 6 weeks to arrive at his rendezvous with RMS Titanic and his date with history. While the leader of the Illuminati was doggy-paddling perkily behind the enormous iceberg, the giant ship that he intended sinking was just finishing her sea trials, preparatory to taking on her first passengers at Southampton. 700 crewmen also came on board on that first day. Everybody was excited to be embarking on such a historic journey. The maiden voyage of the Titanic was expected to be a joyous and exciting affair. Among the first-class passengers were many of the millionaires that David Icke stroke Oink had made the target for his wrath. But there were many second and third-class travellers as well. Most of the poorer ones aboard were heading towards what they hoped would be better life in the New World. The greater part of them would never reach their destination. An iceberg propelled by an evil pig human would make certain of that. The ship called at the port of Queenstown in the south of Ireland to take on the final complement of passengers. Then it headed out into the Great Atlantic Ocean. The next stop was scheduled to be New York. Out in the Atlantic, the leader of the Illuminati paddled on doggedly. He was reaching the area where he hoped to encounter the intended victim of his psychopathic rage. Most of the time he pushed his lethal projectile from underneath the water. His huge lungs, which had a capacity way in excess of those of a blue whale, enabled him to stay under the surface for many minutes at a time. He only needed to stick his snout above the waves for short periods to get some air. Very occasionally, he dragged his great carcass up onto the iceberg in order to give his legs a rest. Once he was spotted by the lookout of a freighter that was in the area. But when the startled seaman reported to his captain that he had just seen an enormous pig spread-eagled on the top of an iceberg, he was accused of being drunk on duty, and he spent the rest of his voyage in custody. David Icke stroke Oink had, of course, slipped back into the water before anyone else got to witness the extraordinary sight. Eventually he reached the location where he wanted to be. It was now just a matter of waiting for Titanic to arrive. The end of RMS Titanic and the escape of David Icke stroke Oink. On the night of the 14th of April 1912, the sea was as smooth as glass. There was a distinct chill in the air. Not many of the passengers on the famous liner were prepared to linger too long on deck. The first class preferred to linger in the saloons, sipping champagne or playing cards. The second and third class also engaged in amusements appropriate to their stations in life and aboard the great ship. Many of them were gone to their beds. None of the voyagers considered that in less than 4 hours the majority of them would be floating corpses on the freezing waters of the Atlantic Ocean. At around 11:30, David Icke stroke Oink heard the throbbing engines of Titanic as it approached the position where he lay in wait behind the huge iceberg. It had lost more than half its size since he had started pushing it from Greenland, but it was still capable of making a great impression if it collided with a ship. Underneath the waterline there were savage, jagged areas of ice where the warming seawater had melted away sections of the berg. They would slice into the hull of any vessel like gigantic can openers cutting into the side of a can. The next few minutes would determine whether all his efforts had been in vain or not. If the ship hit the iceberg right on, it could survive. There would be considerable damage to its bows, but it would be able to limp onwards to the nearest port. Most of the passengers and crew would survive. The evil leader of the Illuminati hoped that the helmsman would try to avoid the iceberg. He wanted to hit the ship on the side. Titanic started to turn in the water. David Icke stroke Oink doggy paddled frantically. His pig's legs had never worked so hard before in his entire life. It was now or never. He was pushing the berg with his enormous snout. The ship was almost side onto him now. With one enormous shove from his 2 front hooves, he pushed the massive colossus of frozen fresh water forward. There was a grating noise as it scraped along the hull of the Titanic below the waterline. The Illuminati leader let out a piggy sigh of relief. It was mission accomplished. All he needed to do now was swim to one of the remoter bays in Newfoundland to await the next wormhole that would take him back to the future. There he could resume his career, making millions out of libeling his betters in order to con sections of the more gullible masses. There we must leave RMS Titanic, foundering in the icy waters of the North Atlantic. It was a great tragedy, and one hopefully never to be repeated. At least now everybody knows how it happened.